Mudgett. Growing Up with Serial Murder, 1965. If I could now recall one circumstance, $1 of money to be gained, a disagreeable act or word upon his part, in justification of this horrid crime, it would be a satisfaction to me. But to think that I committed this and other crimes for the pleasure of killing my fellow beings, to hear their cries for mercy, and pleas to be allowed even sufficient time to pray and prepare for death, all this is now too horrible for even me, hardened criminal that I am, to again live over without a shudder. Is it to be wondered at that since my arrest, my days have been those of self-reproaching torture, and my nights of sleepless fear? Or that even before my death, I have commenced to assume the form and features of the evil one himself? Herman Webster Mudgett, alias H. Holmes. Like the song says, I was born in the USA, but after my dad died, I moved with my mother to her native Canada, arriving in London, Ontario in the fall of '64. We lived in a high-rise apartment near the university, and I went to little old Broughdale School. It was a lonely time for me. I was a stranger in a strange land, dropped amongst kids who had all grown up together. A lonely time, but not a hard time. For you see, there was the Thames. The Thames is a shallow river that runs through London on its way to Lake St. Clair, and is named after the big river in the UK, and it was a 5-minute walk through the woods from our pad. I was a nature boy, and I spent every free moment down by the river, hunting for reptiles and amphibians, bullfrogs and leopard frogs, American toads, garter snakes and turtles, including the weird-looking soft-shelled turtle. Not that I could bring them home. Mom wouldn't tolerate that. So instead I would catch them, observe them, and then let them go, which felt kind of lonely too. Another thing I liked about the woods was no people, or darn few of them. Once there were these guys with a case of beer, and another time a guy and a girl in the bushes. They looked like they were asleep, but they also looked like they didn't have any clothes on. I didn't investigate. One time I met this creepy-looking guy with glasses and a corduroy jacket, who offered me 75 cents if I would stand in the Thames with my shoes on. It seemed too weird to me. What would I do that for? What if I offered you $1? I took off. The guy was a weirdo. I told Mom about it at home, and she immediately wanted to know exactly what I did, if I had seen the guy before, and she kept freaking out, even though I kept telling her that nothing had happened. I don't want you going into the woods anymore, you hear me? There are nuts out there who like to hurt kids. I promised not to go down to the Thames anymore, and I was back the next day. When I wasn't exploring, I was reading. Canadian TV sucked. Every show seemed to be the farm report, so I always had my snotty nose in a book. My favorite was my paperback copy of the Guinness Book of World Records. One record stood out for me. Worst Murderer in History. The worst murderer in history was listed as H. Holmes, real name Herman Webster Mudgett. The book said he had built a big hotel in Chicago called the Castle, with gas chambers, hidden passages, and dissecting tables, and that he had killed as many as 200 people. I was instantly stupefied with terror, not so much with the idea of murder, but more by the idea there were such people in the world. It was my first awareness of the reality of evil. I brooded over the entry, reading and rereading it. There was no picture of Mudgett Holmes in the book, but I had an instant vision of him in my mind's eye, and he looked exactly like Vincent Price. You know, House on Haunted Hill. But stuff happened, and I probably would have forgotten about it if it hadn't been for the dreams. Or perhaps I should say, nightmares. It began with me finding myself in a darkened corridor, which I instantly recognized as being on the 13th floor, the top story of the apartment building. Nobody lived up there, and most of the flats were just empty rooms. We knew because none of the doors were locked, and we would often sneak in and enjoy the great view from the balcony. You could see clear to downtown, plus the dark serpentine Thames, and the spire of the Middlesex College Tower, which looked like something out of an old horror movie. The hallway seemed especially dark, which made me think it must be late at night, when I should be home in bed, asleep. At first I thought I was alone, but then I felt a presence, even though there was no one in sight. I felt myself drawn to one of the vacant apartments, which had its door slightly ajar. The deserted living room was bathed in serious moonlight and appeared totally empty. But then I noticed the shadow of a man standing out on the balcony. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel he was turned towards me, looking towards me. In the distance, the bell in Middlesex Tower tolled the hour. It was midnight. I heard another sound, the hiss of the sliding glass door as the man stepped in from the balcony. I really wanted to run away, but my bare feet were frozen to the cold hardwood floor. As the man drew near, I could see he was staring at me, that he was unsmiling, and that he did look like Vincent Price. And then he sprang. He covered my mouth before I could yell. His hand was slim, almost feminine, with long, sensitive fingers that reminded me of Mom. But he was strong, deceptively strong, and he dragged me across the room and out onto the balcony as if I was made out of toilet paper, lifting me up and throwing me over the railing. I managed to grab the rail with both hands, my bare feet kicking in the cold air. But slowly, methodically, the man, who must have been that H. Holmes guy, began to pry my fingers off the railing, one by one, till I could hold on no more, and plunged into space. The man was silent the whole time, and I didn't even scream as I fell into eternity. Instead, I woke up and found myself standing in the dark and deserted hallway on the 13th floor. I had no idea of how I had got there, how I'd even managed to leave our apartment without Mom noticing, and no idea even as to what time it was, which is when I heard the clock in the Middlesex Tower begin to ring. 12 times. Midnight. The witching hour. I turned towards the staircase to run back home, but stop. Was it all a dream? Or was it all real? Was there someone actually in that apartment? Waiting for me? Holmes, Mudgett, or Price, or whatever his name was? Someone who wanted to kill me? Nah, it could only have been a nightmare. But there was only one way to find out. I slowly, hesitantly made my way down the hall to the apartment in my dream. This time the door was closed, and, after agonizing momentarily, I grabbed the doorknob, turned it, and pushed inside, and somebody yelled and strong arms grabbed me. "What the hell do you think you're doing, you little punk?" He was about 17 and had slick back hair and a black leather jacket. A cigarette dangled out the side of his mouth. He had a firm grip on my pajama top and was giving me a pretty vigorous shake. "Just what do you think you're doing, eh?" I had a bad dream." "Eh?" Leave the kid alone, eh?" This from a second guy, a fatso in a lumberjack jacket with a beer in his hand. "What are you doing here, kid? Ain't you supposed to be in bed?" I could see an open case of beer on the hardwood floor, so I guess these guys were having a party. A private party I'd stumbled into. I had to think fast, and I knew talking about nightmares wouldn't help, so I said, "I just want to look at the moon." "You just want to look at the moon?" "Yes, sir." "Sir?" "You live in the building?" "Yes, sir." "Then go look from your balcony, eh?" Leather Jacket let me go, but gave me a good swift kick in the bum on my way out. He was wearing motorcycle boots. I somehow managed to sneak back into our apartment without waking Mom, but it was a long time before I was able to get to sleep, and a sore rear end didn't help. I was still shook up the next day when I was summoned to the principal's office, even though I didn't think I'd done anything wrong. It terrified me worse than the beer drinkers. When you're in grade 4, the principal is a distant figure, kind of a cruel god. Plus, they gave kids the strap back then, in Canada. Imagine my shock on entering the office to find Vincent Price himself sitting with the principal. "This is Mr. Howard," the principal said. "He's a child psychologist. As you've recently suffered a bereavement—" I had no idea what he was talking about. "He's going to ask you some questions." I was taken to an old storage room to be interviewed in private. Alone, just with Howard, the man from my nightmares. At first he simply asked routine stuff, like my name, how old I was, where I lived, what Mom did, junk like that. When he asked me what I liked to do, I told him about exploring the river. Alone. "You're always alone?" he asked. I realized I'd made a mistake, so I mumbled the other kids were sometimes there. "Isn't your mother afraid of you drowning in the river?" he asked. "1 or 2 children drown in the river each year." I thought this was weird, as the Thames isn't very deep. So how could you drown in it? "Unless someone held your head underwater. Someone who wanted to kill you." Howard then asked me what I liked to read, and I told him about my favorite, the Guinness Book of World Records. "I've enjoyed that book too," Howard said. "What I found most interesting was the section on murder. Did you read it? Did you know a man named H. Holmes had the world record? That he may have killed as many as 200 people, including women and children?" I muttered I hadn't read that section, and after a few more minutes and some rather intrusive questions, I was allowed to leave. After school ended at 4 o'clock, I went into the woods and down to the Thames. It was like I needed nature to calm me down. I wanted to get to a shallow spot where there was a bit of a sandbar, and caught the path under the metal bridge at the top of Richmond Street. I'd only been on the trail for a few minutes when I heard someone calling my name. Turning, I saw Howard approaching, and I realized he had somehow followed me. He was smiling, sort of. But even kids know when a smile is phony. He was not happy with me. I began backing up, and as I did so, he picked up the pace and was no longer smiling. I didn't know what he wanted, but I didn't want to find out. I turned and ran. I heard Howard's angry cries to come back, but I paid no attention, as I had no intention of winding up drowned in the Thames. I knew the woods like the back of my hand, and I knew all the good spots to hide. Soon I was crouched in the tall grass, where I could see, but not be seen. I heard Howard calling me for about 10 minutes, and once I saw him pass by on the trail, his hands clenched in anger. But he didn't see me. I waited another 10 minutes, and then snuck back home. Mom would be back from work, so I figured I was safe. So imagine my shock when entering the apartment to see Howard sitting across from her in our living room. "Oh, there you are," said Mom, beaming. "Mr. Howard here has been telling me all about your conversation today, and I've asked him to stay for dinner." I don't know how I reacted, but I wasn't pleased. He noticed, but Mom didn't. They had been drinking sherry and seemed to be having a high old time. Still, Mom pretended to be mad at me. "Mr. Howard tells me you confessed to sneaking up to the 13th floor to see the view from the empty apartments. You know I told you not to go up there." Oh, I wouldn't scold the boy. And then the son of a bitch called Mom by her first name. He was sure buttering up her good. Yeah, buttering her up real good. "I bet the view is quite spectacular. Perhaps he'd be willing to show me. That is, if it's okay with you." And then he called Mom by her name again. If I didn't watch out, I was going to wind up with Howard as my dad. Imagine having a mass murderer for a father. Next thing I knew, Howard and I were in the elevator, rocketing up to the 13th floor. Staring down at me coldly, he said, "You're not going to run away from me this time." After the elevator had spit us out, he frog-marched me down the hall to the empty apartment, his cold hand firmly gripping my collar. He didn't let go, even when we were standing on the balcony, looking across the city and down at the toy cars in the parking lot below. "You do understand why your mother doesn't want you coming up here," he said in his cloying manner. "It would be ever so easy for an adventurous boy like you to have an accident. A fatal accident." He pushed me against the side of the balcony and, putting his long arms around me, tried to pull me off my feet. He was going to toss me over the side. Without thinking, I instinctively spread my legs, giving me a broad base anchoring me to the balcony floor, while at the same time I grabbed Howard's suit jacket and pulled upward. He was tall, over 6 feet, and he suddenly found himself hanging half over the balcony rail. So I got behind him, and I grabbed his long legs, and I began to push up, 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 push up. He screamed once on the way down. Looking over the edge, I could see him spread-eagled on the asphalt, surrounded by a spreading pool of blood. What followed was a lot of sound and hysterics, signifying nothing much. I told them Howard had raised himself up to look over the side and was hanging way over the edge when suddenly he lost his balance and I pretended to be too upset to say much more. Anything more. I was really trying to block it all out. I had a number of sessions with a child psychologist who concluded I was disturbed. The other kids must have thought so too, as they all kept their distance. But I was fine with it. I still had the Thames and all my animal friends. A year later, we moved away. But a few years ago I had a strange experience when I asked my mom what she remembered about what I described as Howard's End. You know, the teacher that fell from the 13th floor of our apartment building in London. I always thought he was the reincarnation of H.H. Holmes. What are you talking about? You know, the teacher who died. What teacher? He was in our apartment. What? Remember I had to go see a child psychologist? You never saw any psychologist. Mom didn't remember a thing about the incident and started to get angry, telling me the joke wasn't very funny and that I should stop it. Even worse, when I checked the back issues of the London newspapers on microfilm, there was no mention of the accident. I even knew the correct date, May 7th, 1965. Crickets, like nothing ever happened. Did I imagine the whole thing? It all seems so real. But still, there's nothing. No mention. Nada. Is it because I got away from him in the end? And he went back to hell or wherever he came from? I don't know. But what I do know is that I still sometimes dream that I am back in the dark and deserted hallway on the 13th floor of the apartment building in London, Ontario. I have no idea of how I got there, and no idea as to what time it is, when I hear the clock in the Middlesex College Tower begin to ring 12 times. Midnight, the witching hour. For whom the bell tolls. For me. I want to run, but instead I make my way down the hall to the apartment I have seen so many times in my dreams, and, after agonizing momentarily, I grab the doorknob, turn it, and begin to enter. I really hope there's only a punk in a leather jacket on the other side. Really, really, really hope.